Hello and welcome to a Word for This Day podcast. I'm Jory Schaefer, the show's host and creator, and it is my joy and pleasure to welcome you today. Welcome to anyone who's found us for the first time. It is no accident that you are here today, friend, and welcome back to all you regular listeners. I'm so thankful for you. I love being on this journey with you. I continue to pray for all of you regularly. I continue to pray that the Lord would draw you closer to Him and give you more of a desire to know Him and to know His Word, and that you will be very intentional about spending time with Him and spending time in His Word and spending time in prayer and worship, and that you will want to focus your hearts and your minds on Him. Oh, friends, that must be one of our main things on our to-do list every day, is to think about Him and to focus on Him and to seek His will. He wants what is best for us. His will is perfect. We may not understand it. It will likely not fall in line with things that make sense in our minds from the world standpoint. But oh, friends, He can see the whole picture. He knows everything. And so may we trust Him. May we trust Him all the more. Please consider sharing this podcast with your friends, family, neighbors, strangers, just anyone who you think may receive a blessing from it. And know, as always, that I love to hear from you. I love to hear what God's doing in your lives as you're spending more time with Him. And so please send me a message. There's a couple of ways you can find in the show notes to be able to do that. All right. Well, our verse for the day for August the 6th, 2024 comes from the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 6, and it reads as follows from the Legacy Standard Bible. So you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, to walk in His ways and to fear Him. Oh, friends, we talk about this over and over and over again. It is so important. And, the world would say, well, why do I want to follow? Well, they say a lot of things. Commandments. I want to go my own way and do my own thing. And why would I want to follow these old-fashioned rules? Well, just like we talked about, God's ways are best. There is no doubt that when He was giving these rules and statutes and commandments to His children there in the wilderness, He gave them to Moses to give to the people, and it was for their good. It was for their good. Now, we are not bound right on this side of the cross to all those rules that were in the law, but Jesus made it very clear about what was the greatest commandment, and if we would do, or the two greatest commandments, and if we would do those things, that all the rest of it would fall into line. And He says all the law and the prophets were summed up in these two things, and it was to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. If we would do those things, if we will do those things, then all the rest of what God had asked His people to do falls into line. We are not bound under these specific dietary regulations and all of that. And it's because Jesus fulfilled all the law and the prophets. Everything, He was the end of the law for righteousness for all those who would believe. And so I'm just thankful for that. But I'm excited for us to park here because God does not change. God has not changed. Jesus has not changed. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And we see His character. We've seen His character throughout the Old Testament, and we see that in the New Testament. And one of the very important parts of His character is that when He says something, it is true. When He asks us to obey, we must. And it's just so important for us to follow him and to obey what he has asked us to do. And again, it's for his glory and for our good. And so I'm excited for us to think about that. But let's think about first where we are in the scripture. You know, if you traveled this road with me for very long, that this is the part of the podcast that I think it's wise for us to think about where we are. So we are in the Old Testament today. We are in that book of Deuteronomy, which is the last of the 5 books of the law. The Old Testament begins with the 5 books of the law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then it moves to Old Testament history, then to what we call sometimes the wisdom and poetry literature, and then into the major prophets and the minor prophets. And so it's very straightforward the way that the Old Testament is organized. The law was given to Moses to write down by God. And it goes all the way back to the very beginning of creation, all the way up through and right up until the children of Israel were getting ready to cross over into the Promised Land. So there's a lot of stuff here, and I just love that we get to see all of this. But you may say, well, in your mind, well, why would we want to spend time thinking about these things? Well, because we read in the New Testament in, where is it? We just talked about it yesterday because I misquoted it. And first, and then told you the right reference where it was. It's because in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 6, we read that Paul was talking about the things that happened to the children of Israel. And he says, now these things happened as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. There is no doubt that God gave us these things in his word to teach us. We've read in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17 that all scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, correction, reproof, and training. And so these things are necessary for us. They're such good examples. We learn so much better if we will heed examples. You know, I think about times when people have tried to teach me, and if I think, oh no, I want to just go on and do it all by myself, you can't do that often without examples. I think about math when I was in high school, and there's no way that I would have been able to just intuitively know how to do all of that if I hadn't been taught, if I hadn't been shown, if I hadn't been given examples of how to work the problems. And that's just one little thing. I think about when I want to maybe make something or cook something or anything like that. What do? I look it up. I read about the examples. I read how to do it. God has given us that in his word, and it's for our benefit. Genesis, you may recall, goes all the way, as I mentioned, back to the beginning of creation, and takes us from creation to the first people, and then to the first sin and the fall of man, and then what happened to man after that, and then with God starting over with Noah and his family, and then from there how the people spread and the people grew, and then we see about Abraham and then his descendants, and we hear about these children of Israel. Israel's other name was Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Those 12 sons were the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. And those 12 sons, along with Jacob, went down to Egypt. They went down 70 persons. But over a period of about 400 years, they grew up to over 600,000 men. And it's thought that there were at least 2 to 2.5 million total people. And they were enslaved. They were oppressed. And God had told Abraham those hundreds of years before that this would happen, but that he would bring them out. And so he called Moses. He sent Moses to be the leader of these people. And so we read about that in Exodus, and we read about how God told Moses what to do, and Moses really was not excited about the plan, but he obeyed, and God gave him and Aaron the plan, Aaron, his older brother, and God also gave Moses these words to write down. And so we know, based on what Jesus said over in John chapter 5, verses, I believe, 45 through 47, that these words that are written in the law are the words of Moses. So God told him to write these down. We also read that in Deuteronomy 31:9. So Moses is the human author, but God told him what to write. But Exodus tells about that time when the people of Israel were brought out of Egypt, led by Moses. It tells about the rules and the statutes that God gave Moses to give to the people. Leviticus tells more about that law and about the priesthood, and we've talked about that over the last few days when we've been in Hebrews. And then Numbers talks about more of that time, one of the people wandering in the wilderness and their attitude and what that cost them, and what God did because of that. And then Deuteronomy, the book that we're in today, is this series of several farewell addresses that Moses is giving to the people as they're getting ready to cross over into the Promised Land. It should have only taken them about 2 weeks to get, from what I've read, to get from where they were in Egypt to the Promised Land that God had told Abraham that his descendants would have, that would be theirs. But because of the people's grumbling, because of their heart attitudes, because of their disobedience, part of that punishment would be that they were going to have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. It was a day for every day that the spies had gone over into the Promised Land and had been there and seen that it was exactly as the Lord had said, but that they refused and they grumbled against God. And so part of that punishment would be that they would have to wander in the wilderness a year for every day that the spies had been over there. And that also, every person that was 20 years and older at the time that that they'd been led out of Egypt, at the time that they all grumbled, everyone except for Joshua and Caleb would die in the wilderness. So what we see here in Deuteronomy, here at the end, is Moses has been told that he's not going to be able to go over into the Promised Land because of an act of disobedience that he had. But he is making sure that all the ones that are getting ready to cross over know just one more time what God has told them. So he recounts a lot of the things that he had taught them all these years. He's reminding them of these things. He's recounting the 10 Commandments and much of the law. And just this recurrent theme throughout is make sure that you are obeying God and his statutes, and he will take care of you. It will go well with you if you will obey. But if you disobey, it is not going to go well. And so you will see that throughout. Moses was told that he would be able to look over into the Promised Land, but that Joshua would lead the people over. And so I want to pick up here. As I mentioned, we see that throughout Deuteronomy, just these reminders over and over again. And if you think about the punishment that had been handed down, the consequences for the people's grumbling, God had said that as I just mentioned, that everyone 20 years and older, that as they had come out of Egypt, those that grumbled would die in the wilderness. So the people that Moses is giving these addresses to are the people that were either born in the wilderness and of course Joshua and Caleb, they would have been there, but also the ones who were under 20 years of age. So they had grown up and had the families and that sort of stuff. So some of them may have not have seen all of the signs and wonders, but all of them who were there that day would have seen that pillar of cloud by day and the fire by night. They would have seen those things. They would have seen the manna that was given every day. And so they still had seen and hopefully would have heard the stories of how God had brought the people out and about the plagues and how they were able to plunder the Egyptians and how Pharaoh's army was just overcome in the sea, how God opened up that Red Sea for them to cross over. But again, Moses is just reminding them of all of these. And I want you to hear at the very beginning of Deuteronomy, before we get to the section right before our verse for the day, what Moses had told, or what was being said. It says in Deuteronomy 1:1, "These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness in the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel, and Laban and Hazeroth and Dizahab. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Now it happened in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had commanded him to give them. After he had struck down Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and Edrei, across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying, Yahweh our God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, You have stayed long enough at this mountain. Turn and set out and go to the hill country of the Amorites and to all their neighbors in the Arabah and the hill country and in the Shephelah and in the Negev and by the seacoast to the land of the Canaanites and Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. See, I have given over the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to give to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to them and to their seed after them. And Moses goes on and explains and reminds them about what had happened. And then I want to get over to this chapter 8 and read forward from here all the way up to our verse for the day so you can hear. And Moses has been reminding them of God's blessings, of the way that God keeps his covenants all the way up to this point. And he's just reminding them once again. And I want you to hear this. This is just a beautiful reminder. And you'll also hear something that we talk about a lot when we talk about just God's word in general, about how man does not live on bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. You're going to hear that in Moses' explanation here, and I just love that. So in Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 1, leading up to our verse for the day in verse 6, it says, the entire commandment, and remember, this is Moses still talking, that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which Yahweh swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember all the way which Yahweh your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. I love that. He tells why there were tests there. It was to test to see whether or not they would keep God's commandments. And he humbled you and let you be hungry and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your feet swell these 40 years. Thus you shall know in your heart that Yahweh your God was disciplining you, just as a man disciplines his son. And here's our verse. So you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. Oh, I just love that. God gave Moses the words to very clearly articulate to the people, to remind them what God had done, why things had been hard, that God was disciplining them. And friends, God disciplines those that He loves, just like we discipline our children because we know that it will go well with them. We need boundaries. We need rules. We need to know the right way to walk. And we need to know that there are consequences for not walking in the right way. And the consequences for not following God and His commandments lead to death. They lead to destruction. And so Moses is continuing to remind them over and over and over again. And I love that verse right before our verse for the day. Thus you shall know in your heart that Yahweh your God was disciplining you just as a man disciplines his son. So you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God to walk in His ways and to fear Him. We want to keep His commandments because they are right, they are true, they are holy. We must be obedient to God because anything else is unacceptable. Anything else will lead to just our ruin. And if you look over in and I would encourage you, we can't read all of it right now, but if you hop over to the end of Deuteronomy or closer to the end from about, I believe it's about Deuteronomy 28 through 30 or 31, Moses lays it out very clear and reminds them that these are the blessings that will happen for you if you keep God's commandments and His statutes and His rules and you seek Him above all and you have no other gods before Him. But these are the curses that will happen if you don't keep His rules and statutes and you go after the idols of the nations and you do things the way that these heathen nations do them. And He just wanted them so to remember, obey God, trust Him, and He will take care of you. And it's no different for us, friends. When we look at this, so you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God to walk in His ways and to fear Him. That is still the same for us. It's not that we have to keep all those Levitical rules, those rules that were, as I mentioned about food and drink. Paul talks a great deal about that over in his letters because we are no longer under the law. The law couldn't save us, but the law showed us there was a purpose for the law. It showed us what sin was. Paul says, if I hadn't had the law, I wouldn't have known what it is to covet if the law had said, do not covet. And so the law has a very specific purpose. But after Jesus came, who was the end of the law for righteousness for all who would believe, our righteousness, our justification, our right standing with God comes from following Jesus, from believing that what Jesus has done for us on that cross really happened, believing that God sent His Son, His one and only Son, His only begotten Son into this world to walk a completely sinless life, and that He died. He was the sacrifice. Those sacrifices like that were spoken of in the law, like we talked about in Hebrews. Jesus was that one time for all sacrifice, not the example that they had of having to offer multiple sacrifices on multiple days on a recurrent schedule. No, Jesus was that one time for all sacrifice, and it was for everyone who would believe. But we had to understand those examples to see the significance of what Jesus has done. And it's no different for us to follow His commandments. Jesus said, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, when asked what are the greatest commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And all these are summed up in the law and the prophets. So if we do that, we're still doing exactly what God wants us to do. We seek Him first and His righteousness. We walk in His ways. We focus on Him, and we do it with that reverence, with that fear of a holy God, of knowing that our life is in His hands. And that fear that is showing that we know that He is holy, that He deserves all the worship and glory and honor and praise because He's our Creator. He is the author of our salvation. He's our deliverer, our protector, our provider, the one that has forgiven us. And aren't you so thankful? So even though this was written and was told specifically to those children of Israel before they were crossing into the promised land, it is the same for us. May we keep the commandments of Yahweh, our God, and walk in His ways and fear Him. And friends, it will go well with us. Will it be easy here on earth? No, because this walk is not easy because there's sin in the world. But will it go well with us in the long run? Yes, because trusting in Him, believing in Him, obeying Him leads to life eternal. And so be encouraged in that and share this with someone else today. Blessings to you, friends. Until next time.